Feel Good Hemp is the first and only brand to offer high-quality CBD oil products alongside a free platform that offers proven self-help and self-healing techniques, all to help you feel good naturally. Feel Good Hemp was started by Noah and his wife Danielle after they used hemp oil and other techniques to save Noah's father from a terminal cancer diagnosis. Now, I heard this story firsthand when I interviewed Noah. It's a real good one, and it's probably the most heartfelt and compelling story I've ever heard about why someone started a CBD company. So Feel Good Hemp is more than just a great place to buy CBD products. It's actually a community of like-minded souls committed to feeling good and doing good. So use coupon code GENIUS33 at checkout to save a third or 33% site-wide on your first purchase. Visit feelgoodhemp.org to shop now and access their free empowerment platform.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Matthew Cook. He's a professor of medicine. He's the director of the Center for Personalized Immunology. This is at Australian National University. So, Matt, thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard. Nice to be here.
Yeah, if you would, tell me about your research. What are you working on right now?
Well, look, Richard, we're interested in understanding the mechanisms of immune-mediated diseases, which is a very broad group of diseases. One of the approaches that we've been taking, really been concentrating on for a number of years, is to investigate rare immune diseases to try and understand the genetic basis of those rare immune diseases. And once we can try and get some insights into the genetic basis of those diseases, it often gives us access to how the immune system is going wrong, start to dissect the biochemistry and the cellular mechanisms and get to the root of the problem.
Are these autoimmune diseases, or is that a subset of immune-mediated disease?
Well, autoimmune diseases are a subset. We can think about immune diseases in several categories. So certainly autoimmune disease, a large group, overall affect 3% of the population or so. It's a cluster of about 80 diseases, and some are rare and some are more common. So there's that category. There's another category of diseases where the immune response is suboptimal or defective in some way, and this leaves people susceptible to infections, unusually susceptible to infections, and this category is called immune deficiency. And then there are a group of disorders which are due to an abnormal immune response to environmental stimuli. Allergies are an example of this, where an otherwise innocuous environmental antigen is able to stimulate an immune response, but the immune response is excessively vigorous or the wrong type of response, and that results in pathology. So that's the third category of diseases called hypersensitivity disorders. So these don't always occur in isolation. Sometimes people have more than one category, and therefore sometimes when we get insights into one type of disease, it gives us avenues for investigating others.
And what will be the focus of our talk today? There's a particular condition. I just wanted you to elucidate the name and everything.
Yeah. So my group works predominantly on immune deficiency diseases, that category of diseases. But our center, the Center for Personalized Immunology, looks at both autoimmune diseases and immune deficiency diseases.
Okay, and what are the ones that you're looking at right now in particular?
Well, there are a group of rare diseases that arise as a result of genetic variants in a very important transcriptional pathway called NF-kappa B. And so these are a spectrum of disorders that occur in individuals that inherited genetic variants in these genes that are part of this pathway.
Oh, what's the common name for the rare genetic disease or diseases that you're working on?
Oh, well, some of these are so rare that they don't really have a common name. So, we just refer to these as immune deficiency, primary immune deficiency disorders.
Okay. What are the let's say the most prominent ones that you're working on, what are some of the characteristics of the diseases? And then, what are the names that are associated, not the extreme rare ones, but, and then we'll get into questions based on those.
Yeah. Well, patients typically present with recurrent infections as a result of problems with their ability to mount a normal immune response. And sometimes, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, and it seems somewhat paradoxical, they also develop features of autoimmunity. So in one particular syndrome, they develop autoimmune disease, which leads to alopecia. They can develop autoimmune disease of the pituitary gland and sometimes other autoimmune diseases as well. Now, these sorts of autoimmune diseases occur in other contexts, but they occur specifically in this rare single gene disorder. And this exemplifies how studying a single gene disorder can give us some insights into much more common diseases. And you mentioned at the outset your interest in Hyper IgE syndrome or Job syndrome.
Job, like the book of Job, Job syndrome.
Exactly, which was, it got that name because of the very unfortunate manifestations of recurrent boils or abscesses of the skin, which is one feature of that disorder. That's another form of primary immune deficiency disease, which is a useful example as well of how we can get significant insights into the way the immune system works from studying another form of rare immune deficiency disorder.
So what are the primary issues when someone has this Hyper IgE? Like what happens to them at what age? Let's go through the symptomology first and then the underlying reasons, if any.
Yeah. So people with Hyper IgE syndrome usually present in childhood and they can present with pneumonia. And it's usually a bacterial pneumonia caused by Staphylococcus aureus. So a relatively common bacteria, but an unusual cause of pneumonia. And then one of the clues to the fact that the person might be suffering with an immune deficiency is that the infections are recurrent, difficult to treat and recurrent. So Staphylococcus aureus infections of the chest, infections of the skin with the same organisms, and then recurrent bouts of candidiasis or thrush affecting the mouth and the fingernails, sometimes the esophagus, and elsewhere in the gastrointestinal tract. So it's a very unpleasant disorder for these poor patients and also, carries a significant risk of long-term lung damage as a result of the recurrent pneumonia.
So what is going wrong at the genetic level or epigenetic level? What's happening? Are there proteins that are not being made properly or malformed, or, what's happening to cause these issues?
Yeah. So this was a mystery for a long time. The syndrome was first identified in the 1960s, and then an additional feature was identified through diagnostic laboratory analysis of these patients. They were found to have high levels of IgE, which is a class of immunoglobulin. We have 5 classes of immunoglobulin. The levels of IgE in these patients were extraordinarily high. Hence the name Hyper IgE syndrome, which is the other name besides Job syndrome. So those were the things that were recognized for quite a while. And then about 20 years ago, significant progress was made and the genetic basis was identified. It was determined that this syndrome resulted from mutations in a gene called STAT3. Now, STAT3 is a signaling and transcription molecule that's important for regulating various aspects of immunity. But even once that mutation was identified, it wasn't completely clear, it wasn't immediately obvious how mutations in that gene could cause such a complex syndrome. But within a couple of years, several groups, including ours, were able to identify the cellular problem in the immune system that was conferred by these mutations in STAT3. And that was a deficiency of a subset of T cells called Th17 cells. And so these individuals have a significant deficiency of this subset. And that proved how important this subset is in mediating body's defenses against this narrow spectrum of pathogens, including Candida and Staphylococcus aureus, which are the dominant infections that occur in these patients.
So quick question here. Is this just a heightened immune response to everything, or is it selective in what the immune response is heightened to? And if so, what are the specifics of it?
No, on the contrary, it's a deficient immune response. So the problem is the failure to generate a competent immune response to these microbes, particularly Candida and Staphylococcus aureus. And it's a specific failure to generate a subset of T cells, which is normally the key component of the immune response to those pathogens.
So is it a reduced response, or in some cases zero response? Is it ever at the point where there's no response?
No, it's a reduced response because this is what's called autosomal dominant disorder. So individuals have a mutation in one of two copies of STAT3. So normally the STAT3 protein is encoded by two STAT3 genes, one on each chromosome. But in these individuals, they only have one good copy of that gene. So effectively, they're only making half the normal amount of normal STAT3. But STAT3 works by forming dimers, that is, two STAT3 proteins bind in a complex. And so if you only have one normal copy, then you can see that you'll only have a quarter of the normal dimers. And so effectively they're running on 25% of the normal amount of STAT3 dimers, and that's enough to cause these fairly catastrophic changes in their immune system.
So when you say there's an under response, what does that look like? Is there just not enough of these specialized T cells to address, Candida, for instance, or is it that the T cells are unable to take action in a certain way? Like, how would you characterize the under response?
Well, our immune system is set up, on a just-in-case basis. We have this tremendous diversity within our immune system so that the immune system has components that can recognize any pathogen that we come in contact with. So that's the case for all of our T cells, and it's the same for all of our B cells. But we can just concentrate on T cells for a moment. So we have billions of different T cell specificities in what's called our naive T cell repertoire. But because of this enormous diversity, the number of cells which are specific for any pathogen in the naive repertoire are very small and not really enough to mount an effective immune response. So when we come in contact with a bug for the first time, those rare naive T cells that are able to mount an immune response get activated and they proliferate, they expand. So we start to generate a meaningful population of cells. And once that meaningful population of cells is generated, they also differentiate to acquire specific functions. And that enables them to tailor the response to the specific pathogen. So in this case, what's meant to happen when we come in contact with the Candida yeast or Staph aureus is that the T cells that are responding proliferate and then they differentiate to become these Th17 effectors. But because of the mutation in STAT3, that differentiation process doesn't occur. So they're left without that component, which appears to have evolved under the selective pressure of these pathogens.
Supplementing with hemp CBD products is one of the best things you can do for your overall wellness or to improve conditions like chronic pain, sleep issues, anxiety or depression, or other conditions related to inflammation. Feel Good Hemp offers high-quality CBD oil products alongside a free platform of proven self-help and self-healing techniques, all to help you feel good naturally. They're offering our listeners a very generous 33% off their first purchase. Use the coupon code GENIUS33 at checkout, and you'll save 33%. Visit feelgoodhemp.org to shop now and access their free empowerment platform. Well, from what I've learned, let's say people with peanut allergies, and I know this is different, but they're given like super minute amounts of peanut, every day to get them used to and accustomed to it so they don't have an overreaction. Could something similar be done where a tiny amount of Candida and Staph aureus, et cetera, are,
given to the patient and they're exposed to it so they can build up more of a response? Has that been tried?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't been tried, but unfortunately, that's unlikely to work. So with peanut allergy and all allergies, what we think is going on is that hypersensitivity disorders. So it's like the flip side to what we're dealing with here in Job syndrome, where specific components of the immune system are overactive. They're generating an overabundant response to what is, after all, a very innocuous stimulus. Peanuts don't have any inherent danger for us if we're not allergic. So mounting an immune response is inappropriate. And so you're right, under some circumstances, allergen immunotherapy is highly effective. But what's thought to be happening in allergen immunotherapy is that the nature of the immune response that's being mounted to the peanut, for example, or the grass pollen is changed. So this is the important point, that the immune system, a normal immune response depends on both quantity and quality. And so immunotherapy is changing the quality of the immune response to adjust the nature of the effector response rather than necessarily silencing it. Now, in Job syndrome, that just won't work. One, the problem is a deficiency, a fundamental deficiency. And the second problem is that this is genetically conferred. So there's a deficiency of a protein, and no amount of environmental manipulation can lead to production of normal amounts of that deficient protein.
Well, is there a way to, when someone is not exposed to, these pathogens, is there a way to get them to respond a little bit, make some of the protein, then somehow culture it? And then when they have an episode where they are exposed to Candida or some other insult, they're given back their own proteins, and therefore there's enough to fight off an infection when it's in an acute stage.
Well, in this case, it's difficult to do that because of where the protein is located in the cell and the nature of its response. But the approach that you've just mentioned, Richard, it has been used in other forms of immune deficiency. So sometimes replacing the missing protein, the protein that's deficient as a result of a genetic variant, has been a successful strategy.
Okay. I mean, if you were able to wave a magic wand and get a therapy tried out immediately that you think what do you think would have the highest likelihood of working, and why? What would be the mechanism?
Well, in a condition like Job syndrome, obviously a lot of people have given a lot of thought to how to approach therapy. And at the moment, treatment for these patients depends on prompt use of antibiotics and antifungal agents to treat the existing infections. And then consideration has been given to replacing the missing components. Now, as I said, just replacing the deficient STAT3 is not really practical for a number of reasons. The next thing that's considered in patients with various forms of immune deficiency is whether replacing bone marrow would be useful. So doing a hematopoietic stem cell transplant so that the cells of the immune system are replaced by someone else's cells, and that might correct the defect.
Yeah, it seems a lot more radical than trying to build up reserves and, autosomally, or however you want to put it, giving them back to the person at the right time when they need it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if for the conditions where protein replacement has been possible, for genetic disorders where protein replacement is used, it's highly effective, but it usually requires regular injections of that protein. So that's a lifelong therapy because most of the proteins are cleared or used relatively quickly. Whereas a stem cell transplant, in cases where it is applicable and if successful, is curative. Now, the other
stem cell transplants have literally been long-term curative?
Well, for Hyper IgE syndrome, the situation is more complicated because the STAT3 gene is expressed in many different cells, and not just the blood cells. So stem cell transplant has been tried in a few instances of Hyper IgE syndrome, and it hasn't been tremendously successful. But in other forms of primary immune deficiency, stem cell transplant can be curative, where the gene acts primarily within the just in the blood cells, the cells of the immune system, then it can be highly successful.
Person that's immune competent, if they get exposed to candida, I mean, I've heard of people getting yeast infections and other kinds of, overgrowths and inflammations. Like, what's the mechanism in a regular person, and why would these infections take hold versus someone that has this issue?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and it illustrates how, understanding more about these rare disorders gives us insights into the normal immune response. So what the Hyper IgE or Job syndrome taught us was the absolute critical nature of this Th17 response for normal Candida responses. And that was backed up by subsequent discoveries in other patients with rare disorders where they were predisposed to recurrent Candida infections, where they were found to have deficiencies of this Th17 subset as well, arising from different mechanisms. And so in a normal person, a Th17 response in the mucosa of the mouth and the esophagus is really the crucial component of the immune, or a crucial component of the immune response that normally prevents that infection from taking hold. If your immune system is depleted, even if you don't have a genetic predisposition, if your immune system is suppressed for any reason, for people who receive corticosteroids or immune suppressants for another reason, often they develop the complication of Candida, but then that goes away once their immunosuppression is reduced or ceased.
Okay. So are there any clues from healthy people on how to fight an infection like this, or not really?
Well, yeah, the most important clues come from understanding those people who have heightened susceptibility. And that tells us about what's going on under normal circumstances to help fight infections. And that's, overall, that's sort of our strategy here for understanding the mechanisms of rare immune disorders we get, because the immune system is so complex. I think the other lesson from the Hyper IgE syndrome is the specificity of different components of the immune system to particular pathogens. Right? There are a large number of pathogens that humans are exposed to, and different components of the immune system appear to be adaptations for defending us against different sorts of pathogens. And that's really been proven by characterizing many different types of immune deficiency and seeing how different defects in the immune system predispose to different types of pathogens.
What are the factors that make a normal, healthy person predisposed to have problems with Candida or other organisms like that?
Well, it's true that that Candida is prevalent, and many people have do get it from time to time, and we don't know for sure what's going on. We suspect that there's probably some variation in the normal host response. That's very hard to pinpoint. This illustrates the other factor of, the ability to dissect mechanisms from looking at rare instances, because once we identify the genetic variant, a single genetic variant, then it's a soluble problem. Whereas in individuals who have subtle variations in their immune response that lead, say, to transient candidiasis, it's very hard to work from that group to understand what's going on. But once we understand what's going on from studying the rare individuals, then we can draw some inferences about what might be going on in the more common circumstances.
What about the microbiome of people that have Hyper IgE? Has that been studied, and what's been observed?
Well, it's, one of the reasons that Candida and Staph aureus, for that matter, are prevalent infections is that they are often part of the normal microbiome. Staph aureus is often a colonizer of the skin in normal individuals, and Candida is often part of the normal microbiome as well. So, but it's an interesting question. How might things be perturbed as a result of either a problem with Th17 cells in Hyper IgE syndrome, or as a result of the excessive abundance of these two components of the microbiome? And that one's a bit hard to resolve. Which is coming first? Are the other components of the microbiome being perturbed by the underlying defect, or is it, are they being perturbed by the overgrowth of the Staph aureus and yeast?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess I wonder if there's not underwhelming response to Candida and certain other microorganisms. I would guess that the person's microbiome has changed to a degree where, maybe it's not just their immune system alone that is fighting off Candida or Staph aureus, but maybe their underlying microbiome is not supportive of it for some reason. Just guessing here, but just came to mind, so that's why I asked.
Yeah, no, I think it's a reasonable postulate. And, and there's a lot of interest in trying to answer that question. Again, it's quite a difficult and challenging, while it's an excellent postulate, it's quite a challenging postulate to prove.
Well, what seems to modulate people's response to Hyper IgE? Like, have people tried dietary interventions? Has that had any effect? Like, are certain populations seemingly predisposed to it, more men than women? Or, what are the commonalities in it that's been observed?
In the Hyper IgE syndrome, well, it's a highly penetrant Mendelian disease. So it's largely determined by the presence or absence of this rare genetic variant.
Okay. Is there any intuition as to why it's rare? Why is it not more common? Why does it happen at all? Any idea of what causes it?
Well, because it's due to a single gene variant, and, single gene diseases or Mendelian diseases have a similar prevalence. And that just comes down to, the fact that fortunately DNA replication is pretty accurate. And so the acquisition of genetic variants is rare. So
is this heritable at all, or is it really more of a random?
So it's a genetic disorder. It's an autosomal dominant genetic disorder. So it's inherited as an autosomal dominant from one generation to the next. Now, sometimes, as with many genetic disorders, it can arise as a new mutation, a so-called de novo mutation. But even then, once it's arisen, then 50% of the offspring of that person carry the risk of acquiring the variant.
Does it tend to happen more in male children versus female children? And is the carrier more the woman in the relationship and the man? No,
it's what's called an autosomal dominant disorder. It's on a chromosome. It's not on the X chromosome. So it has an equal prevalence in males and females.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So, what's the current research say? Like, what are the main hypotheses that people are testing to try to intervene in this condition and make it better?
Well, now that we know the genetic variant that's responsible, we know the mechanism that occurs, progress is going to flow probably from more general progress in this group of disorders called primary immune deficiency disorders, because the likely areas where we might see progress in the future is through therapies that are directed at genetic disorders. And so obviously there's a lot of work going on at the moment to try and, to consider various forms of gene therapy that might enable us to overcome single gene disorders such as this.
Are there different types of Hyper IgE patients?
Yes, so it is the case that not every patient with immune deficiency and high levels of IgE carry a variant in STAT3. And so there are we now know of several other forms of primary immune deficiency that can present with manifestations that overlap a bit with those of the of Job syndrome. And we now know about, the genetic variants that are responsible for those as well. So about 90% now of people who present with immune deficiency and high levels of IgE we can make a precise diagnosis in.
Oh, are there main types of people that have Hyper IgE, but different types? Or does it seem to manifest as one condition and it always has the same set of complications to it?
Well, yeah, there's some overlap. So predisposition to infection, high levels of IgE, but there are also some differences. So one of the other Hyper IgEs arises as a result of variants in a gene called DOC8. And these people present with some additional skin infections, particularly viral infections of the skin, and sometimes have more prominent vascular complications, inflammation in the blood vessels, and sometimes inflammation elsewhere in the body as well.
Well, very good. What do you see as coming as possible good treatments, or at least, additional understandings in hyper IgE? What's on the radar for the next few years in your observation?
As I said, I think that the treatments for primary immune deficiency overall will depend on us. Most of the effort is going into, one, understanding the conditions better, and then once we understand them, thinking about what sort of replacement or correction therapy might be best. Now, not all of those replacement or correction therapies are even feasible at the moment, but that's what we're looking towards. So we've discussed how sometimes we might replace the missing protein, we might replace the missing cells, but in the future, perhaps we'll be able to correct the genetic defect specifically.
Well, very good. Where can people find out more information about your work, Matthew? Where can they go?
Well, they can see what we're doing by looking at the Centre for Personalized, just Googling the Centre for Personalized Immunology, which is our research centre here in Canberra in Australia.
Okay, well, very good. Matthew, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed the discussion.
Remember, before you go, supplementing with hemp CBD products is one of the best things you can do for your well-being. Get your CBD from a company that cares and offers you holistic support in your healing or wellness journey. Feel Good Hemp is giving our listeners 33% off their first purchase. You can use coupon code GENIUS33 at checkout to save 33% site-wide. Visit feelgoodhemp.org to shop now and access their free empowerment platform.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.